I stood there in the middle of the backyard, my hands gripping a plastic cup of lemonade, my eyes locked on Natalie as she climbed onto a chair, her voice cutting through the chatter like a knife. "We've chosen a name for the grandma," she said, her smile wide but her gaze sharp, landing on her mother across the crowd. "It's gonna be Nana for my mom. As for Terry's mom, well, she won't be called anything at all." The words hit me like a punch to the gut, my breath catching as the whole party went quiet, everyone staring at me waiting for a reaction. I didn't move, didn't speak, just felt the heat rising in my chest, my fingers tightening around the cup until it cracked. Natalie didn't flinch. She just stepped down her arm, looping through Terry's like she hadn't just torn my heart out in front of 50 people. Before I dive into this story, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and comment with where you're watching from. Your support means everything. I'm Danielle, 67 years old, living in Nebraska, and this is the story of how my son's wife Natalie ripped apart our family, starting with that gender reveal party. I'd spent weeks helping plan it, my savings covering the catering, the decorations, even the balloons that spelled out "boy" in bright blue. Terry, my only son, stood there beside her, his face blank like he didn't know what to say. I kept waiting for him to step in to say something, anything, but he just looked at the ground, his hands stuffed in his pockets. That silence from him hurt almost as much as Natalie's words. I'd raised him alone after his dad left us. When he was 5, poured every penny I had into giving him a good life. And now, here I was, being erased from my grandson's world. I didn't make a scene that day. I wanted to scream to grab Natalie by the shoulders and ask her why she hated me so much, but I just turned and walked back to my car, the lemonade cup still crumpled in my hand. I drove home, my mind racing, replaying every moment of the last 3 years since Terry brought Natalie home. She'd been polite at first, but cold like she was sizing me up. I tried to be warm, offered to help with their wedding, paid for the venue, even when it meant dipping into my retirement fund. But Natalie always kept me at arm's length, her smiles never reaching her eyes. I thought maybe she'd warm up once the baby came, but that party showed me she had no intention of letting me in. By the time I got home, I was shaking, not just with anger, but with a kind of hurt I hadn't felt since my divorce. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the stack of bills I'd been helping Terry and Natalie pay. Their rent, their car insurance, even their phone bills. I'd been covering it all because Terry lost his job last year, and Natalie said she couldn't work while pregnant. I'd never complained, never asked for a thank you, but after what she said, I felt like a fool. I picked up the phone and called my lawyer. "I need to make some changes." I told him, my voice steady, even though my hands weren't. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do, but I knew I was done being used. The next day, I stopped the automatic payments to their accounts. No warning, no explanation. I canceled the car insurance I'd been paying for, sent a text to Terry, saying he'd need to figure it out himself. He called me an hour later, his voice panicked. "Mom, what's going on? Why'd you do this?" I took a deep breath, tried to keep my tone even. "You heard what Natalie said, Terry. I'm not your family anymore, so why should I keep paying for you?" He stammered, tried to make excuses. Said Natalie, "Didn't mean it like that," but I cut him off. "She meant it." And you didn't say a word to stop her. I hung up before he could respond, my heart pounding, but my resolve firm. For the next few weeks, I didn't hear from them. No calls, no texts, nothing. I kept myself busy cleaning out the garage, volunteering at the church, anything to keep my mind off the ache in my chest. But every night, I'd lie awake, wondering if I'd done the right thing. I loved Terry, always would, but I couldn't keep giving to someone who let me be humiliated like that. And Natalie, I didn't even know where to start with her. I'd never done anything to make her hate me, but it was clear she'd been waiting for a chance to push me out. Then, one morning, about a month after the party, I got a call from my lawyer. He'd been working on something I hadn't told anyone, about a change to my will. I'd always planned to leave everything to Terry, my house, my savings, the small plot of land my parents left me. But after the party, I couldn't stomach the idea of Natalie getting her hands on it. I told my lawyer to put it all in a trust. 1. Terry could only access after I was gone, and only if he was no longer married to Natalie. It felt extreme even to me, but I needed to protect what I'd worked for. I wasn't going to let her win. That same day, I got a text from Natalie, the first contact since the party. "You're really cutting us off. You're punishing your own son, because you're jealous." I stared at the message, my blood boiling. Jealous. I'd given them everything, and she had the nerve to call me jealous. I didn't respond, just deleted the text and blocked her number. I wasn't going to let her drag me into a fight. But the message stayed with me, gnawing at me like a splinter. I started to wonder if Terry was really okay with all this, or if Natalie was pulling the strings, making him go along with her. A few days later, I ran into Terry's old high school friend Mark at the grocery store. He looked uncomfortable when he saw me, but I asked him straight out if he'd heard from Terry. Mark hesitated, then said, "He's not doing great, Danielle. He's stressed about money, and Natalie's been intense." I pressed him for more, but he just shook his head, said he didn't want to get in the middle. That conversation stuck with me, made me question whether Terry was as complicit as I thought. I started to feel a flicker of guilt for cutting him off so completely, but then I'd remember Natalie's voice at the party, the way she'd smirked when she said, "I'd be nothing to my grandson." That memory was enough to keep me firm. By the time Natalie was close to her due date, I'd rebuilt my life without them. I'd joined a book club, started taking yoga classes, even planned a trip to visit my cousin in Colorado. I was finding ways to fill the hole they'd left, but it wasn't easy. Every time I saw a baby stroller or heard someone talk about their grandkids, it was like a knife twisting in my chest. I wanted to be part of my grandson's life, wanted to hold him, teach him the things I'd taught Terry. But Natalie had made it clear that wasn't going to happen. Then one night, I got a call from the hospital. It was Terry, his voice shaking. "Mom, the baby's here. He's healthy, but Natalie's not doing great. Can you come?" I froze, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to rush to the hospital to see my grandson, to be there for Terry. But another part, the part that was still raw from the party, held me back. "I'll think about it," I said, and hung up before he could say more. I sat there in the dark, my phone still in my hand, wondering what to do next. That's when I realized this wasn't just about Natalie anymore. It was about my grandson, and whether I could find a way to be in his life without letting her destroy me. The hospital call left me, rattled my mind spinning, as I sat in my living room, the clock ticking past midnight. Terry's voice kept echoing in my head, the way it cracked when he said Natalie wasn't doing great. I wanted to believe he needed me, that this was his way of reaching out, but the memory of the gender reveal party kept pulling me back. I'd been burned before, and I wasn't about to run to their side just because they snapped their fingers. Still, the thought of my grandson lying in a hospital crib, his tiny hands curling in the air, made my chest ache. I didn't sleep that night, just sat there weighing my options until the sun came up. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I'd go to the hospital, but not for Natalie, or even Terry. I was going for my grandson. I packed a small bag, grabbed my keys, and drove the 20 minutes to St. Pactory. Mary's my heart heavy with a mix of hope and dread. When I got there, the receptionist directed me to the maternity ward, and I found Terry in the hallway, his face pale, his clothes wrinkled like he hadn't changed in days. He looked up when he saw me, his eyes wide with relief. "Mom, you came," he said, stepping toward me, but I held up a hand, kept my distance. "Where's the baby?" I asked, my voice sharper than I meant it to be. Terry flinched, but nodded toward a room down the hall. "He's in there with Natalie. She's stable now, but it was rough. Emergency C-section." I nodded, took a deep breath, and walked past him toward the room. I wasn't here to hash things out with Terry, not yet. I just wanted to see my grandson. When I stepped into the room, Natalie was in the bed, her face pale, her hair plastered to her forehead. She looked up, saw me, and her expression hardened. "What are you doing here?" she snapped, her voice, weak but dripping with venom. I ignored her, my eyes locking on the bassinet next to her. There he was, my grandson, his tiny chest rising and falling, a blue knit cap on his head. I stepped closer, my throat tight, as I reached out to touch his hand. He was perfect, his fingers so small, they barely wrapped around my thumb. "His name's Ethan Terry," said from behind me, his voice soft. I nodded, didn't turn around, just kept my eyes on Ethan, my heart swelling and breaking all at once. For a moment, it was just me and him, the rest of the room fading away. But then Natalie spoke again, her voice cutting through the quiet. "Don't get too attached, Danielle. You're not his grandma. My mom's coming tomorrow, and she'll be the one he knows." I froze my hand still, on Ethan's, my blood turning to ice. I turned to face her, my voice low but steady. "You don't get to decide that, Natalie. He's my grandson, too." She laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that made my skin crawl. "You're nothing to him. You think showing up here changes anything. Terry, tell her." I looked at Terry standing in the doorway, his face twisted like he was caught between two fires. He opened his mouth, but no words came out, just a helpless shrug that made my stomach drop. I didn't say another word, just turned back to Ethan, gave his hand one last squeeze, and walked out. Terry called after me, but I kept going my steps fast, my vision blurring with tears I wouldn't let fall. By the time I reached my car, I was shaking my hands, fumbling with the keys. I sat there for a long time, my forehead pressed against the steering wheel, trying to make sense of it all. Natalie's words kept replaying in my head, each one like a slap. But worse was Terry's silence, his inability to stand up for me, even now. I'd come to the hospital hoping for a bridge, a way to rebuild, but all I'd found was more walls. When I got home, I didn't unpack, just went straight to my desk and pulled out the trust papers my lawyer had sent over. I read through them again, my eyes lingering on the clause about Terry only getting the inheritance if he wasn't married to Natalie. It had felt like a safeguard before, but now it felt like the only way to protect myself. I signed the papers, my hand steady this time, and mailed them the next day. I wasn't just cutting them off financially anymore. I was drawing a line in the sand. For the next few weeks, I kept my distance. Terry texted a few times, sent pictures of Ethan that I saved but didn't respond to. Every time I looked at those photos, my heart ached, but I couldn't bring myself to reach out. I didn't trust them. Didn't trust that Natalie wouldn't find a way to hurt me again. Instead, I threw myself into my new routines, the book club, the yoga classes, the trip to Colorado I'd planned. I was trying to build a life that didn't revolve around Terry and Natalie, but it wasn't easy. Every time the phone rang, I'd brace myself half expecting another hospital call another crisis. Then, one day, about 2 months after Ethan was born, I got a letter in the mail. It was from Natalie, handwritten on lined paper, like she'd ripped it out of a notebook. I almost threw it away. Unopened, but curiosity got the better of me. I sat at my kitchen table, slid it open, and started reading. "Danielle," it began. "I know you hate me, and I don't blame you. But we're struggling. Terry's still out of work, and the medical bills are piling up. We need help. I'm not asking for me. I'm asking for Ethan." She went on to say she was sorry for what she said. At the hospital, claimed she was stressed out of her mind, didn't mean it. She ended with a plea for me to come see Ethan to be part of his life. I read the letter 3 times, my emotions swinging from anger to pity to suspicion. Part of me wanted to believe her, wanted to think she was reaching out in good faith. But another part, the part that had been through too much, couldn't shake the feeling it was a trap. I'd given them so much already, and what had it gotten me? A public humiliation, a son who wouldn't stand up for me, a daughter-in-law who saw me as the enemy. I folded the letter, put it in a drawer, and didn't respond. But I couldn't stop thinking about Ethan, about the way his tiny hand had felt in mine. A week later, Terry showed up at my house unannounced. He looked worse than he had at the hospital, his eyes bloodshot, his clothes rumpled. "Mom, we need to talk," he said, pushing past me into the living room. I crossed my arms, kept my distance as he paced the floor. "Natalie's sorry. Okay, she's been under a lot of pressure. We both have. We need you, Mom. Not just for money, but for Ethan. He deserves to know you." I listened, my jaw tight, as he rambled on about how hard things had been, how they couldn't keep up with the bills, how Natalie's mom wasn't helping as much as they'd hoped. When he finally stopped, I took a deep breath, looked him in the eye. Terry, I love you, and I love Ethan. But I can't keep doing this. Natalie made it clear, I'm not family, so why should I keep acting like I am? He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like he didn't know what to say. She didn't mean it, he finally mumbled. But I shook my head. She meant it. And you let her say it. Until you figure out how to stand up to her, I can't be part of this. I walked to the door, held it open. He left without another word. His shoulders slumped, like I'd taken something vital from him. That night, I sat alone, my mind racing. I'd drawn my line, but it didn't feel like a victory. Ethan was out there growing every day, and I was missing it. I pulled out the letter from Natalie, read it again. My heart torn between wanting to help and knowing I couldn't trust her. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let Natalie control it anymore. The weeks after Terry's visit were a blur of quiet days and restless nights, my mind stuck on Ethan and the family I was losing. I kept Natalie's letter in that drawer, but I didn't touch it again, couldn't bring myself to reread her words. They felt like a hook baited with just enough guilt to pull me back in. I was done playing her games, but the thought of Ethan growing up without me was a weight I couldn't shake. I started looking for ways to stay connected to him without going through Natalie and Terry, ways that didn't leave me open to more hurt. I reached out to a lawyer friend from church, Susan, who specialized in family law. Over coffee at a diner in town, I laid out the whole story. The gender reveal, the hospital, Natalie's letter, all of it. Susan listened, her face calm, but her eyes sharp as she took notes. When I finished, she leaned back, sipped her coffee, and said, "Danielle, you've got options, but they're not easy. Grandparents' rights in Nebraska are tricky. You'd need to prove Terry and Natalie are unfit parents, or that cutting you out would harm Ethan." I nodded my stomach, twisting at the thought of dragging my own son through court. "What else can I do?" I asked. She suggested starting small, documenting everything, keeping records of my attempts to stay in touch, even the financial support I'd given them, before I cut it off. "Build a case," she said. "Even if you don't use it. It'll give you leverage." I took her advice, went home and started a file. I printed out bank statements showing the thousands of dollars I'd paid for their rent, their insurance, their groceries. I saved every text from Terry, every photo of Ethan he'd sent. I even wrote down what happened at the gender reveal party, every word I could remember Natalie saying. It felt like preparing for a war. I didn't want to fight, but it gave me a sense of control, something I hadn't had since that day in the backyard. Meanwhile, I kept hearing bits and pieces about Terry and Natalie through mutual friends. Mark, the guy from the grocery store, texted me one day, said he'd seen Terry at a bar looking rough, talking about how they might lose their apartment. I wanted to call Terry to check on him, but every time I picked up the phone, I'd see Natalie's face, hear her voice, telling me I'd never be Ethan's grandma. Instead, I sent Mark a quick message, asked him to let me know if things got worse. I wasn't ready to step back in, but I couldn't turn my back completely. Then one afternoon, I got a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. It was Natalie's mom, Linda, her voice nervous, like she wasn't sure she should be calling. "Danielle, I know things are bad between you and Natalie," she said, "but I'm worried about Ethan. They're not doing well. The apartment's a mess, and I don't think they're eating right. I'm only here for a week, and I can't fix it." I gripped the phone, my mind racing. Linda had never reached out before, had always stayed in Natalie's corner. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. She hesitated, then said, "Because you love Ethan, and I think he needs you." I didn't know what to make of it. Part of me wondered if Natalie had put her up to it, another trap to pull me back in. But Linda's voice sounded genuine, and the thought of Ethan in a messy apartment not getting what he needed lit a fire in me. I thanked her, hung up, and called Susan right away. "What can I do if I think Ethan's not being taken care of?" I asked. She told me to start by visiting to see the situation for myself, but to be careful not to escalate things with Natalie. "Take notes," she said. "And if it's bad enough, you can file a report with Child Services." The next day, I drove to Terry and Natalie's apartment, my heart pounding as I parked outside. I hadn't been there since. Before the gender reveal, hadn't seen them in months. I knocked on the door, half expecting Natalie to slam it in my face. Terry answered instead, his eyes wide when he saw me. "Mom, what are you doing here?" he asked, his voice low, like he didn't want Natalie to hear. "I want to see Ethan," I said, keeping my tone firm. He hesitated, then stepped aside. "Let me in." The apartment was worse than I'd imagined. Dishes piled in the sink, trash bags stacked by the door, the air thick with the smell of unwashed laundry. Ethan was in a bouncer in the living room, his diaper sagging, his face sticky with what looked like applesauce. Natalie was on the couch, scrolling her phone, barely looking up when I walked in. "What do you want?" she muttered, not even trying to hide her irritation. I ignored her, knelt down by Ethan, and wiped his face with a tissue from my purse. He smiled at me, his little hands reaching out, and for a moment I felt like I could breathe again. I didn't stay long, just enough to see Ethan hold him for a few minutes, before Natalie snapped at me to leave. Terry walked me to the door, his face a mix of guilt and exhaustion. "We're trying, Mom," he said. "It's just hard." I looked at him, wanted to shake him, tell him to get it together for Ethan's sake. Instead I said, "I'm not doing this for you, or Natalie. I'm doing it for him." I left my hands shaking as I drove home, but my mind made up. I wasn't going to let Ethan grow up like that. That night, I wrote down everything I'd seen, the state of the apartment, Ethan's condition, Natalie's attitude. I called Susan again, asked her to help me draft a letter to Terry and Natalie. It was simple, but clear. I wanted regular visits with Ethan, starting with once a week supervised if they insisted. If they didn't agree, I'd take it to court. Susan helped me word it, so it was firm, but not threatening, said it was the best way to start without burning bridges. I mailed the letter the next day, my stomach in knots, but my resolve stronger than ever. A week later, I got a response, not from Terry, but from Natalie. Another handwritten note. This one angrier than the last. "You think you can bully us into letting you see Ethan? You're not his family, Danielle. Stay out of our lives, or you'll regret it." I read it, my blood boiling, but I didn't let it shake me. I called Susan, showed her the letter, and she nodded, said it was exactly the kind of thing we needed to build a case. "Keep pushing," she said, "but be ready for them to push back." They did push back. A few days later, Terry called me, his voice tense. "Mom, why are you doing this?" "Natalie's freaking out, says you're trying to take Ethan away." I took a deep breath, kept my voice calm. "I'm not trying to take him, Terry. I just want to be his grandma. If you and Natalie can't handle that, I'll do what I have to." He went quiet, then said, "I don't know what to do, Mom. She's my wife." I wanted to scream that Ethan was his son, that he needed to step up, but I just said, "Figure it out, Terry. For Ethan." I hung up, my heart heavy, but my mind racing with what came next. I started preparing for the possibility of court. Susan helped me gather more evidence texts from Linda, confirming the state of the apartment, a statement from Mark about Terry's drinking. I hated it. It felt like betraying my own son, but I kept picturing Ethan in that bouncer. His diaper unchanged, his little face dirty. I couldn't let that be his life. I didn't know if I'd win in court, didn't even know if I could go through with it, but I was ready to fight for my grandson, no matter what it took. The decision to go to court didn't come easy, but by the time I filed the petition for grandparent visitation, I knew it was the only way. Natalie's last letter had been a line in the sand, and Terry's inability to stand up to her left me no choice. I wanted Ethan to have a stable, loving presence in his life, and if his parents couldn't provide that, I'd fight to make sure I could. Susan warned me it would be a battle, said Nebraska courts didn't always side with grandparents, but she believed we had a shot if we could show Ethan's well-being was at risk. The process started with a flurry of paperwork. Susan helped me file the petition, laying out my case, how I'd been a constant in Terry's life, how I'd supported him and Natalie financially, how Natalie had deliberately cut me out. We included everything, the bank statements, the text from Linda, the notes I'd taken after visiting their apartment. I even wrote a statement about the gender reveal party, how Natalie had humiliated me in front of everyone. It was painful putting it all on paper, but it felt like reclaiming my voice, like I was finally standing up for myself. Terry and Natalie didn't respond at first, but when they did, it was through a lawyer, a guy who sent a letter claiming I was harassing them and that my petition was baseless. Susan read it and snorted. "They're bluffing," she said. "But we need to be ready for them to play dirty." She was right. A week later, I got a call from a social worker saying she'd been assigned to evaluate Ethan's home environment. Natalie had reported me claiming I was unstable and trying to steal Ethan. I was furious, but Susan told me to stay calm, said it was a chance to get an impartial look at their apartment. The social worker's visit to my house came first. I spent the day cleaning, even though my place was already spotless baked cookies, to make the house smell warm. The worker, a woman named Karen, was kind but thorough, asked about my relationship with Ethan, my health, my finances. I showed her the file I'd been keeping, told her about the gender reveal, the hospital, everything. She listened, took notes, said she'd be visiting Terry and Natalie next. I didn't hear from her again for weeks, but the waiting was agony, like sitting on a powder keg. Meanwhile, I kept hearing rumors through friends. Natalie had been telling people I was crazy, said I'd shown up at their apartment uninvited and scared Ethan. It was a lie, but it spread fast enough that I started getting sidelong glances at church. I wanted to confront her to set the record straight, but Susan told me to keep my head down, said anything I did could be used against me in court. So I stayed quiet, focused on Ethan, and the fight ahead. The court date came 3 months after I filed. I walked into the courthouse, my stomach in knots, Susan by my side. Terry and Natalie were already there, sitting with their lawyer, a slick-looking guy in a suit that probably cost more than my car. Terry wouldn't meet my eyes, but Natalie stared me down her face, a mask of defiance. Ethan wasn't there. Susan had warned me he wouldn't be, but I'd brought a photo of him, tucked it in my purse for strength. The hearing was a blur of legal jargon and tense exchanges. Susan presented our case, showed the judge the evidence we'd gathered. She called Linda as a witness, who testified about the state of the apartment, said she'd been worried about Ethan's care. Natalie's lawyer tried to paint me as a meddling busybody, said I was jealous of Natalie's mom and trying to control Terry's life. It took everything in me not to stand up and yell, but I kept my face neutral, my hands clasped tight in my lap. The social worker's report was the turning point. Karen took the stand, read from her notes about her visits. She described my home as stable and welcoming, said I was clearly capable of providing a positive influence. Then she turned to Terry and Natalie's apartment. The home was cluttered and unsanitary, she said, with visible safety hazards. The child's needs appeared to be inconsistently met. I saw Natalie's face tighten, saw Terry shift in his seat. The judge listened, asked a few questions, then said he'd need time to review everything. We left the courthouse with no decision, just a promise that we'd hear soon. Susan said we'd done well, but I couldn't shake the image of Terry's face the way he'd looked so defeated. I wanted to talk to him, to tell him this wasn't about hurting him, but Natalie was right there, her arm looped through his like a chain. I went home alone, sat at my kitchen table, and prayed for the first time in months, asking for strength for Ethan, for all of us. 2 weeks later, the judge's ruling came in the mail. I was granted visitation, 1 supervised visit a week, to start with the possibility of more if things went well. It wasn't everything I'd hoped for, but it was a start, a crack in the wall Natalie had built. I cried when I read it, not out of sadness, but relief. Ethan would know me. I'd get to be his grandma, even if it was just for a few hours at a time. The first visit was at a community center, a neutral space with a social worker, watching adios. Terry brought Ethan looking nervous, but trying to smile. Natalie wasn't there, Susan said. She'd refused to come. I held Ethan in my arms, his weight solid and warm, and for those 2 hours it was like the world made sense again. I sang to him, played with the toys I'd brought, told him stories about his dad when he was little. Terry watched, said little, but I could see the guilt in his eyes. When it was time to go, he hugged me quick and hard whispered, "I'm sorry, Mom," before taking Ethan and leaving. I kept up the visits every week, building a bond with Ethan that felt like a lifeline. But things with Terry and Natalie didn't get better. I heard from Mark, that they'd moved to a smaller apartment, said Terry was working odd jobs but struggling. Natalie had started posting online about how I'd ruined their lives, called me a monster who'd turned the court against them. I wanted to ignore it, but it hurt seeing my name dragged through the mud. Still, I kept my focus on Ethan, on the visits that were starting to feel like the best part of my life. Then one day, Terry showed up at my house alone. He looked better than he had in months, his eyes clear, his clothes clean. "I'm leaving Natalie," he said, standing in my living room, his voice steady. "I can't do this anymore. I want to be a better dad for Ethan, and I need your help." I stared at him, my heart racing, not sure if I could trust what I was hearing. But the look in his eyes told me he meant it, and for the first time in years, I felt like I might get my son back. Terry's words that day, in my living room, were like a door swinging open after being locked for years. I wanted to believe him, wanted to think he was finally ready to step up for Ethan, but I'd been burned too many times to just jump in with both feet. I sat him down, made him a cup of coffee, and said, "Tell me everything, Terry. No excuses." He nodded, took a deep breath, and started talking. He told me about the fights with Natalie, how she'd been controlling everything from their money to who he could talk to. He said he'd been scared to leave because of Ethan, but the court case, the social worker's report, had been a wake-up call. "I don't want him growing up in that mess," he said, his voice breaking. "I want better for him." I listened, my heart torn between relief and caution. I'd spent so long angry at Terry for letting Natalie run the show, but seeing him now vulnerable and trying, I couldn't help but feel for him. I told him he could stay with me for a while, but only if he was serious about getting his life together. "No drinking, no going back to her," I said, my tone firm. "You're here for Ethan, not for a free ride." He nodded, said he'd do whatever it took. I didn't know if he'd follow through, but I was willing to give him a chance. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Terry moved into my spare room, got a job at a warehouse in town, started going to AA meetings. I helped him file for custody of Ethan, hired Susan again to guide us through the process. Natalie didn't make it easy. She fought every step, sent angry texts, called Terry a traitor, said I'd brainwashed him. But Terry held firm, started standing up to her in ways I hadn't seen before. It wasn't perfect. He had rough days, doubted himself, but he kept showing up for Ethan, and that was enough for me. The custody battle dragged on for months, but in the end, the judge gave Terry primary custody, with Natalie getting supervised visits. The social worker's report from before, plus Natalie's erratic behavior during the hearings, tipped the scales. Ethan moved in with us, his toys and clothes filling my house with life. I'd lie awake at night, listening to his soft breathing through the baby monitor, my heart full, but my mind still on guard. Natalie was still out there, and I didn't trust her to let this go. Sure enough, she didn't. She started showing up at my house, unannounced, banging on the door, demanding to see Ethan. I called the police, the first time got a restraining order after the third. Terry was shaken, said he felt guilty for putting us through this, but I told him to focus on Ethan. "She's his mom," I said, "but you're his dad. You've got to protect him now." He nodded, started working with a therapist to deal with the guilt and the years of being under Natalie's thumb. Meanwhile, I poured everything into Ethan. Our weekly visits had grown into daily life, feeding him, reading to him, taking him to the park. He was starting to talk, calling me Gammy in his little voice that melted my heart. I kept the trust in place, still didn't fully trust Terry not to slip back into old habits, but I rewrote my will to include Ethan directly. If anything happened to me, he'd be taken care of no matter what. A year after Terry left, Natalie things started to settle. He was promoted at work, moved into his own place nearby, kept Ethan most of the time, but let me have him whenever I wanted. Natalie's visits were sporadic. She'd moved out of state, said she was starting over, but I didn't trust it to last. I kept my guard up, saved every text, every voicemail, just in case she tried to pull something. One evening, Terry came over for dinner, Ethan asleep in my lap. We sat at the kitchen table, the house quiet except for the hum of the fridge. "Mom," he said, his voice soft, "I don't know how to thank you for not giving up on me on Ethan." I looked at him, saw the boy I'd raised, and the man he was becoming. "You don't have to thank me," I said. "Just keep being his dad." He nodded, reached across the table, and squeezed my hand. That night, after they left, I sat alone, my house full of Ethan's toys, my heart fuller than it had been in years. The fight wasn't over. Natalie could come back. Life could throw more curves. But for now, I had my grandson, my son, and a family I'd fought for. I looked at the photo of Ethan on my fridge, his smile bright, and thought about the gender reveal party all those years ago. Natalie had tried to erase me, but I was still here, still Gammy, and no one could take that away. If this story hit, you check out the next one on your screen. Click subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming. Thanks for being here.